Hey, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies, and we're going to jump into another lecture. We took last week off. Today we're going to talk about the personality. The subject matter is making the personality passive and the essence active. So we started talking about that in the previous class. So just a quick review, we talked about the Gnostic perspective of the universe in the first class, and the idea of consciousness, the four states of consciousness, and the need to awaken the consciousness so that we don't go to sleep, psychologically speaking, consciously speaking. Then we talked about how to study ourselves, the idea of self-study, and that the primary method of self-study is self-observation, to observe our interior world. Then we talked about our interior world, the human machine, the human organism that we have, and the 3 brains, or 5, sometimes 7 centers, depending on how you count them, but synthesized as the 3 brains: intellectual, emotional, and action, which is motor, instinctive, sexual. Then we talked about attitude and character, maybe my favorite class, because so much useful information about how our attitude is shaped by our perspective, and we can change our attitude by changing our perspective. And that by changing our perspective and looking at life differently, as was mentioned in that class, taking life as a gymnasium, an opportunity to strengthen ourselves, then we are not so put off by the adversities that we encounter. We're able to deal with them in a totally different way, with a totally different attitude. And that we also talked about how the prominent attitude, the dominant, we could even say dominant attitude, ends up being our character. So it's a very interesting way to look at things. If we want to change our character, we want to change ourselves, what we are, then we need to look at our attitude on a daily basis, and not just our attitude periodically, but really analyze it so that we can determine if it's something that we want to spend our energy doing. Next, we talked about our particular psychology, where we introduced the concept of the egos, or I's, the multiplicity that we have within, the psychic aggregates. You'll hear people talking about voices in their head, or internal dialogue, or I've even seen a movie that was intended for children where it indicated that there was a voice in the head that could be silenced in a particular way. And so the idea with Gnosis is that there are entities inside of us. Every human being, or humanoid, whatever you want to say, has these entities inside of them that are multiple ones, and that they need to be discovered and comprehended and eliminated. So that's what we're going to get into in the last phases of this introductory series. But the idea is that we are not a single individual, but really we have lots of individuals inside of us, lots of different egos, desires, whatever you want to call them, that can conflict with each other, that can create lots of problems for us. The example given was that we're like a country where someone can be king for a day, and then afterwards all the other people, all the other beings in the country have to deal with whatever that person that was king for a day yesterday did. They have to deal with it today. And this is what happens to us. So we're really getting into a deep aspect of psychology now. And so we brought up the difference between ego and essence. In the 6th class, we talked about the essence. Essence, we also mentioned in the very first class, as the spark of divinity. That we are now in a physical form on this planet that rotates around the sun and spins, and the moon goes around this planet. And we have our physical organism that has its laws and its centers of gravity and its movement. But we are not the physical organism. We're not the body. We're not the personality, even. That's what we began talking about. That we, when we talk about the thing that has a possibility of development in us, in terms of getting closer to divinity, the only thing that can get closer to divinity within us is the essence, that spark of divinity, that potential flame, that seed of soul that we have within. And that's the thing that we need to develop. Not our egos, not our desires, not our personality. We need to have a working physical body as much as possible. We want to treat it well. We want to, do the necessary measures so that it's strong and healthy, so that it can take care, so that it can be useful while we're navigating this physical world. And we want to develop our essence. And so we compared and contrasted the personality and the essence. Let's just review the previous class, which was, I believe, 2 weeks ago now. The real and the imaginary. What's real in us is the essence. What's imaginary is the personality. The essence that we have came from the Milky Way and descended, passing through various phases before manifesting as a physical organism, or through the physical organism that we call our body, our physical body, our physical organism. And that is, so the essence manifests through the physical body. It's not the same thing. So the point being that we, as an essence, are not the physical body. And so what happens is, as we grow and develop, our consciousness, the consciousness of the essence, is born totally self-conscious, totally aware of itself, in the third state of consciousness. But we only have about 3% of free consciousness when we're born. That's not already bottled up within our egos or eyes, our desires, our psychic aggregates. As we grow, what happens is the so-called adults, the so-called friends and family, people around us, they teach us, formally or informally, how to develop our personality. Personality, this is from chapter 8 of In Search of the Miraculous by Peter Ouspensky. Personality is created partly by the intentional influences of other people, that is, by formal or informal education, and partly by involuntary imitation of other people by the child themselves. Right? We imitate others, say, oh, I want to be like that person because I like that they get attention from my parent, or I like that they get attention from my sibling or from whomever. Or I want to be left alone, so I want to imitate this person who gets left alone. Whatever it may be. And so we develop this thing called personality. And personality is not who and what we are. It is imagined or it is developed related with this life, and specifically it corresponds to the culture and the time period that we are raised in, that we were brought up in. But the point being that it's not really real the way the essence is real. The essence is real because it is connected with divinity. It doesn't go away with time. The personality, when the physical body dies, the personality goes to the grave. But the essence continues on. It may even possibly get another physical body. So what happens is the personality that we get likes what the culture that we were brought up in recommends or rejects. We're sort of conditioned. The personality is conditioned through what's going on with culture. The point being that inhibits the essence from growing and manifesting itself. So real work of Gnostic psychology is to allow the essence to become active and to make the personality passive. We need this balance between personality and essence that in general our culture doesn't want us to have. Culture teaches us to develop personality, and it says this is, XYZ is the way that personality should be. This is good, that's bad. But there's no real learning, there's no real understanding, because we just are mechanically doing that. So now we're studying about self-observation. We're studying about how to know ourselves, self-knowledge. How do we do that? Observing our personality, the personality itself, not accepting it as good or bad, as right or wrong, as anything other than just a personality, a compilation of education, formal and informal, on how to interface with the culture that we grew up in, or maybe the culture that we live in now. And so we need to study ourselves in order to differentiate between personality and essence in ourselves. Then we said that there's 4 different manifestations of the personality that are mechanical manifestations that we should in particular observe. Lying, that is when somebody says, "How are you doing?" we say, "Good," even if we're not. The second is mechanical imagination or fantasy. We could say daydreaming. That is not being serious, sincere with ourselves and others, which of course is very similar to lying. Sometimes it's lying to ourselves instead of lying to others. And then the third mechanical manifestation of the personality is the expression of negative emotions. That is, we don't really need to express negative emotions. What we need to do is determine why they exist inside of us. We need to observe them. If we don't resist the expression of negative emotions, we're not saying to repress them, we're saying that we want to say to ourselves, it's not okay for me to be angry, to yell, to make a scene, but I need to determine why I'm upset. What's going on inside of me? Why do I feel like this? I don't need to justify the expression of negative emotions, which people very often call sincerity. Instead, I need to look at why I want to express negative emotions. But the only way that we can do that is if we put up a red flag for ourselves that says, no, we're working with a special psychological work to not express negative emotions. Doesn't have to be that we're doing it, permanently. It can be that right now we're testing it out to see what it's like to not express negative emotions. We want to see what that does to our interior work. See if that assists us in observing something inside of us, writhing around that wants to express itself, which we would call an ego. So clearly we need to understand the difference between repression versus just not using our words and our actions to express something so that we can observe it inside of ourselves. It's an important distinction. And the fourth mechanical manifestation of the personality is talking. That when we resist talking, then we realize that we're wasting our words a lot. When we make an effort not to just blurt out whatever thought or feeling or sensation or words manifest in our interior, we start to see more of those egos we mentioned in class 5, of those eyes, of those desires, of those psychic aggregates. And the whole point of self-observation and self-study is to discover those aspects of ourselves that we want to eliminate from our interior. And so these 4 steps, these 4 mechanical manifestations of the personality, give us another aspect to observe, not just the personality, but these 4 things. And we said that the essence falls asleep through identification and considering. So now we're going to look at making the personality passive and the essence active. So we'll just read to you this quote from chapter 8 of In Search of the Miraculous, the end of the previous class, before we jump into today's class. A very important moment in the work upon oneself is when a person begins to distinguish between their personality and their essence. A person's real individuality can only grow from their essence. It can be said that a person's true individuality is their essence, grown up and mature. But in order to enable essence to grow up, it is first of all necessary to weaken the constant pressure of personality upon it, because the obstacles to the growth of the essence are contained in personality. If we take an average cultured human being, we shall see that in the vast majority of cases their personality is the active element, while their essence is the passive element in them. The inner growth of a person cannot begin so long as this order of things remains unchanged. Personality must become passive, and essence must become active. So that's what we're jumping into today. Actually, part 7. Essence versus personality and its mechanisms. Making the personality passive and the essence active. So, continuing from chapter 8 of In Search of the Miraculous by Peter Ouspensky. The development of the essence depends on the work upon oneself. Personality must become passive and essence must become active. This can happen only if buffers are removed or weakened, because buffers are the chief weapon with which personality holds essence in subjection. So we're going to talk about these themes today, buffers, roles, and memory, which are related with impressions. So it says the buffers are the chief weapon with which personality holds essence in subjection. So it's important to understand what buffers are. We'll jump into it. For inner growth, for the work upon oneself, a certain development of personality as well as a certain strength of essence are necessary. Personality consists of roles and of buffers, resulting from a certain work of the centers. So we covered what the centers are, right, in class 3. The intellectual, emotional, and action centers. And it says personality consists of roles, which we'll see are memories, and buffers, resulting from a certain work of the centers. So that means we have different ones in different centers. An insufficiently developed personality means a lack of roles, that is, a lack of knowledge, a lack of information, a lack of material on which the work upon oneself must be based. Roles are memories. They're like scrolls where we store information. Without some store of knowledge, without a certain amount of material that is not one's own, basically from the personality, a person cannot begin to work on themselves. They cannot begin to study themselves. They cannot begin to struggle with their own mechanical habits, simply because there will be no reason or motive for undertaking such work. So what it's saying is that we need to have a personality already developed to realize that the personality is not the essence. And that we acquire certain things mechanically through the personality, which teaches us how we're mechanical. What is our memory, according to Gnostic psychology? In order to understand this, we must learn to regard each center as a separate and independent machine, consisting of a sensitive matter similar to a mass of photographic rolls, or a very special roll of film or recording material. All that happens to us, all that we see, all that we hear, all that we feel, all that we learn is registered on these rolls. This means that all external events and internal states leave certain impressions on the rolls. Okay, so let's explain what that means. We receive impressions through the 5 senses. They enter in, and then, so we receive data. It's like an input, right? We receive data through the senses. We hear things, we see things, we smell things, taste things. We sense things. They come in, and then something happens when they enter in. They go to the intellectual center, or they go to the emotional center, or they go to the motor center, or the instinctive center, or the sexual center. And then those centers process that information. And they remember what they processed. They record it on these rolls. And it's important to understand the term impression. Because as we go back and we start to work on ourselves, meditating on things that happened in the past, we have that data with us. I remember when, my parent or my coworker or somebody was upset with me because I did this, and it made a very strong impression on me. I can bring that back up in my meditation and work through why I felt the way that I felt. So, impressions is a very good word, because they actually are impressions or imprints left within ourselves. An impression can be deep, or it can be very slight, or it can simply be a glancing impression that disappears very quickly and leaves no trace after it. But whether deep or slight, they are nonetheless impressions. And these impressions on roles are all that we have. They are all our possessions. If you've heard of people that have near-death experiences, they often say that their whole life flashes before them, or very many memories flash before them. So we have access to that, and we don't need to wait until we're on our deathbed or some crazy thing happens to us. We can access that and work through that stuff in our meditation. Everything that we know, everything that we have learned, everything that we have experienced is all there on our rolls, in our memory. Exactly in the same way, all our thought processes, calculations, speculations consist only of comparing the inscription on rolls. The only way that we can really understand things is by comparing them to other things that we've already learned about. So you can see how this makes it, that this way of analyzing allows us to really get deep into why we feel this way, why we think this way. Well, because we're comparing from only what we have before, what we've experienced before. So sometimes we don't have a reference point. But most of the time, the personality uses the reference point of something that we know in the past that may or may not be relevant to the thing that we're experiencing. So understand this, because we're trying to really drive home how mechanical we are and how the mechanism of the personality works. Exactly in the same way that everything we've experienced is on rolls, all our thought processes, calculations, speculations consist only of comparing the inscriptions on rolls, reading them again and again, and trying to understand them by putting them together, and so on. Just like when we're young, sometimes music influences us and we want to imitate or compare with the music that we hear, the lyrics, what they say, or the video, if they had videos that went with the songs. And we're constantly referencing them internally. So as long as we are not developed, we can think of nothing new, nothing that is not on our rolls. We can neither say nor do anything that does not correspond to some inscription on the rolls. Inscriptions or impressions on rolls are connected by associations. We associate things together. Something might be good, something might be bad. Associations connect impressions that are either received simultaneously or in some way similar to one another. It is quite clear that different simultaneous impressions connected together will remain longer in memory than unconnected impressions. All impressions of a moment, of an external event, are connected and remain connected in memory through some sort of association. The same is also true with impressions connected together by their inner similarity. So we may have lots of memories of external events. Maybe we played sports, or we went to go see someone else play sports. And so those are all connected together, related with that sport or related with that sort of activity. And then we also may have connected together lots of different things, associating them together within ourselves. Whenever I feel sad, whenever I feel happy, whenever I feel calm, whenever I feel nervous. And so we can connect them all, and we have them grouped together in a certain way. Those are just some examples. There could be many, many others. But that's how we associate impressions together within ourselves. Either we group them together because they're similar in an external way or in an internal way. And so we have to, part of the work on ourselves would be going back and looking at those associations, meditating on them in order to see if those are real associations or if they're just mechanical, egoic associations. If one is more conscious at the moment of receiving impressions, then one more definitely connects the new impressions with similar old impressions, and they remain connected in memory. On the other hand, if one receives impressions in a state of identification, then one simply does not notice them, and their traces disappear before they can be consciously appreciated or associated. In the state of identification, one does not see and one does not hear. One is completely in one's grievance, or in one's desire, or in one's imagination or fantasy, daydreaming, in regards to the object of one's own identification. One cannot separate oneself from things or feelings or memories, and one is completely shut off from access to the world around them. Have you ever been thinking about something, and then someone is calling your name and you don't even hear them? And then they raise their voice, and then all of a sudden, whoa, you hear them. Because in that moment, you're concentrating, or you're thinking, or you're identified with whatever it is, and that's taking all of your attention. We often think in a very naive way. We think that we can do. To get rid of this conviction is more difficult than almost anything else. We do not understand all the complexity of our organization, and we do not realize that every effort, in addition to the results desired, even if it gives these, every effort also gives thousands of unexpected and often undesirable results. And the chief thing that we forget is that we're not starting from the beginning with a nice, clean, new machine. There stand behind us many years of a wrong and stupid life, of indulgence in every kind of weakness, of shutting our eyes to our own errors, of striving to avoid unpleasant truths, of constant lying to ourselves, of self-justification, of blaming others, and so on and so on. All this certainly affects the machine. The machine is dirty. In places, we could call it rusty. In some places, artificial appliances have been formed. The necessity for which has been created by our own wrong way of working. These artificial appliances will now interfere very much with all our good intentions. They are called buffers. So now we're going to study what buffers are. We just talked about roles. Because remember, what we studied in the beginning is that personality consists of roles and buffers. Roles are the scrolls where we keep our impressions and associate them together, which is our memory. And now we're going to look at what buffers are. Buffer is a term which requires special explanation. Buffers on railway carriages are like bumpers on automobiles. They are devices which lessen the shock when carriages or trucks strike one another. So that they decrease the shock when two things strike against each other, like a bumper. If there were no buffers, the shock of one carriage or truck striking another would be very unpleasant and even dangerous. Buffers soften the results of these shocks and render them unnoticeable and imperceptible. Exactly the same appliances are to be found within the human being. They are created not by nature, but by the human being themselves, although involuntarily. The cause of their appearance is the existence in a person of many contradictions. Contradictions of opinions, feelings, sympathies, words, and actions. If a person throughout the whole of their life were to feel all the contradictions that are within themselves, they could not live and act as calmly as they live and act now. They would have constant friction, constant unrest. We often fail to see how contradictory and hostile the different eyes or egos of our personality are to one another. If a person were to feel all these contradictions, then they would feel what they really are. They would feel that they are crazy. It is not pleasant for anyone to feel that they are crazy. Moreover, a thought such as this deprives a person of self-confidence, weakens their energy, and deprives them of so-called self-respect. Somehow or another, one must either master this thought or banish it. One must either destroy contradictions or cease to see them and to feel them. But a person cannot destroy contradictions. However, if buffers are created, then they can cease to feel the contradictions. And so, we will not feel the impact from the clash of contradictory views, contradictory emotions, contradictory words, etc. Buffers, just oftentimes in the class, when we're giving classes physically, and students are there, they like to ask questions. What is a buffer? Can you give us an example of a buffer? And in the United States, the one that I think of that's sort of the most shocking, the most contradictory, is that we have many people that claim that they're Christian, but they also support violence, whether it be from the so-called police, from the so-called military, and they support that, and yet it's almost as if they haven't been studying the information related to their religion. But we know that they do often study it. So somehow in themselves they were able to create a buffer that allows them to both claim Christian and justify violence. Now, of course, we know that there is need to protect ourselves and to not just lay down and be driven over by a vehicle. But we have to be very careful with our actions because we acquire karma through them. And so, without going into too much detail in that direction, that's, in my opinion, a very obvious example. Buffers are created slowly and gradually. Very many buffers are created artificially through so-called education. Others are created under the hypnotic influence of one's own surroundings, one's surrounding life. A person is surrounded by people who live, speak, think, and feel by means of buffers. Imitating them in their opinions, actions, and words, a person involuntarily creates similar buffers in themselves. Buffers make a person's life easier. It's very hard to live without buffers. But they keep a person from the possibility of inner development, because buffers are made to lessen shocks. And it is only shocks that can lead a person out of the state or level of being in which they live. That is, only shocks are what can awaken a person. Buffers lull a person to sleep. They give them the agreeable and peaceful sensation that all will be well, that no contradictions exist, and that they can sleep in peace. Buffers are appliances by means of which a person can always be in the right. When we can never be wrong. When we're like that, it's very hard for us to learn, because we have the attitude that we already know everything. So buffers lessen shocks, and we need shocks in order to awaken, to wake us up out of that sleep. Buffers help a person not to feel their conscience. In ordinary life, the concept conscience is taken too simply. Actually, the concept conscience in the sphere of emotions is equivalent to the concept consciousness in the sphere of the intellect. Meaning, just like we think we're conscious of what we do, we also often feel that we have a conscience. And since we have no consciousness, we have no conscience. Consciousness is a state in which a person knows all at once everything that they know in general, and in which they can see how little they do know and how many contradictions there are in what they know. Conscience is a state in which a person feels all at once everything that they in general feel or can feel. And as everyone has within them thousands of contradictory feelings, which vary from a deeply hidden realization of one's own nothingness and fear of all kinds, to the most stupid kind of self-conceit, self-confidence, self-satisfaction, and self-praise, to feel all of this together would not only be painful, but literally unbearable. If a person whose entire inner world is composed of contradictions were suddenly to feel all these contradictions simultaneously within themselves, if they were to feel all at once that they love everything, that they love everything they hate, and hate everything they love, that they lie when they tell the truth, and that they tell the truth when they lie, and if they could feel the shame and horror of it all, this would be the state which is called awakened consciousness. Since a person cannot live in this state, then they must either destroy contradictions or destroy conscience. Well, we cannot destroy conscience. But if we cannot destroy it, then we can put it to sleep. That is, we can separate by impenetrable barriers one feeling of self from another, never seeing them together, never feeling their incompatibility, nor the absurdity of one existing alongside another. But fortunately, for the human being, that is, for one's so-called peace of mind and psychological sleep, this state of conscience is very rare. From early childhood, buffers begin to grow and strengthen in a person, taking from them the possibility of seeing their inner contradictions. And therefore, for that person, there is no danger whatsoever of a sudden awakening. Awakening is possible only for those who seek it and want it, for those who are ready to struggle with themselves and work on themselves for a very long time and very persistently in order to attain it. For this, it is necessary to destroy buffers, that is, to go out to meet all those inner sufferings which are connected with the sensations of contradictions. Moreover, the destruction of buffers in itself requires very long work, and a person must agree to this work, realizing that the result of their work will be every possible discomfort and suffering for the awakening of their conscience. Conscience is the only thing that can create the unity which a person lacks in that state in which they begin to study themselves. This conscience is not suffering. On the contrary, it is a joy of a totally new character which we are unable to understand. But even a momentary awakening of conscience or consciousness in a person who has thousands of different eyes or egos is bound to involve suffering. And if these moments of consciousness become longer, and if a person does not fear them, but on the contrary cooperates with them and tries to keep and prolong them, then an element of very subtle joy, a foretaste of the future clear consciousness, will gradually enter into these moments. As has been explained before, there are many qualities which people attribute to themselves, which in reality can belong only to people of a higher degree of development. Things such as individuality, a single and permanent self, consciousness, willpower, the ability to do, a state of inner freedom. All these are qualities which, according to Gnostic psychology, ordinary people do not yet possess. To this same category belongs the idea of good and evil, the very existence of which is connected with a permanent aim, with a permanent direction, and with a permanent center of gravity. The idea of good and evil is sometimes connected with the idea of truth and falsehood. But just as good and evil do not exist for the ordinary human being, neither do truth and falsehood exist. Permanent truth and permanent falsehood can only exist for a permanent human being. If a man continually changes, then for him truth and falsehood will also continually change. And if people are all in different states at every given moment, then their concepts of truth must be as varied as their concepts of good. A man rarely notices how he begins to regard as true what yesterday he considered false, and vice versa. He does not notice these transitions, just as he does not notice the transitions of his own eyes or egos from one to another. In the life of an ordinary person, truth and falsehood have no moral value of any kind, because a person can never keep to a single truth. Their truth changes. If for a certain time it does not change, it is simply because the truth is kept by buffers. Consequently, their truth and their falsehood have no objective value. Neither one depends upon the person, both of them depend upon buffers. And this is equally true when applied to a person's words, to their thoughts, their feelings, and to their conceptions of truth and falsehood. In order to understand the interrelation of truth and falsehood in life, a person must understand falsehood in him or herself, the constant, incessant lies that he or she tells themselves. These lies are created by buffers. Remember, buffers allow us to not see the contradictions we have inside. In order to destroy the lies in oneself, as well as lies told unconsciously to others, buffers must be destroyed. But then how can a person live without buffers? Buffers automatically control a person's actions, words, thoughts, and feelings. If buffers were to be destroyed, all mechanically learned control would disappear. A person cannot exist without control, even though it is only an automatic or mechanical control. Only a person who possesses conscious willpower, that is, who has conscious control, can live without buffers. Consequently, if a person begins to destroy buffers within themselves, they must at the same time develop conscious willpower. And as willpower cannot be created in a short space of time, a person may be left without buffers demolished. Left with buffers demolished, and with a will that is not yet sufficiently strengthened. And this is why understanding, or what we call comprehension, is necessary. Schools of the fourth way demand understanding or comprehension before anything else. Not just mechanically learning things, not just developing new buffers. We want understanding or comprehension from the beginning. Results of efforts are always proportional to our comprehension. If a person wishes to create individuality, real individuality of their own, then they must first free themselves from general laws. General laws are by no means all obligatory for a person. One can free oneself from many of them by freeing oneself from buffers and from mechanical imagination or fantasy, that is daydreaming. So think of all the, we're not talking about the physical laws of a country or a state or something like that. We're talking about the laws related with the creation of the universe and our position in the universe. Right now we live on this planet, and our culture has certain, quote, laws and rules. All this is connected with the liberation of the essence from personality. Personality feeds on mechanical imagination or fantasy, that is daydreaming and falsehood. If the falsehood in which a person lives is decreased, and mechanical imagination or fantasy is decreased, then the personality very soon weakens, and then the essence has the opportunity to manifest itself. So now we've come to the end of today's material. We'll read you the conclusion, but we're going to open it up for questions and comments if you have any. So please feel free to submit them. So if we want our essence to become active, that means that we need our personality to become passive. And to do this, we must work on the comprehension of our memories or roles of knowledge related to the centers of the human machine and their associated impressions, associations, and then what comes with that is our daydreaming or mechanical imagination or fantasy. Let's work on an example. Let's say that somebody famous is on television or in the newspaper or magazines or on YouTube or any kind of media source, and they have a certain appearance. They may be similar to ourselves, they may not be. They may be someone that we're attracted to, they may be someone that we want to imitate. But in any case, what happens is the culture, through that media, let's say it's an attractive woman in a YouTube video, we receive that impression, and then the culture, which is, in the case of our example, the people producing the video, so we may or may not agree with that culture, or we may or may not accept it as our own culture, but they're always trying to present it as this is the best thing, this is the greatest thing, this is how we do it. And so now we're starting to receive those impressions, and then we're comparing them to the impressions, the roles, the memories we have already. We're saying, oh, this person is X, Y, and Z. Oh, I like this person. Oh, I dislike this person because they remind me of that person, or I like them because they remind me of this other person. All of that is constantly going on, unconsciously inside of ourselves. And that's part of why it's so important for us to observe ourselves, so that we can be conscious at the moment of receiving those impressions. Then what happens after we receive them? If we're conscious, then we can see how we used to associate them together. And then we don't have to associate them in the same way. If we're not conscious while we receive those impressions, then the egos grab those impressions and associate them where they want to in order to persist in their plan, which is to keep us asleep psychologically, which is producing more mechanical imagination, more fantasy, more dreams. Oh, if I could look like this person. Oh, if this person was dating me, or if I was dating them, if we were, friends. Oh, then this, then that. And then we're not present anymore. We're not here. We're not in the third state of consciousness. We're daydreaming about this. And then next time we see a person, we compare them to that fantasy related with the impressions and the associations that we have. So this is why it's so important to analyze our roles of memory, the impressions that we associate in certain ways, and then what other mechanical imagination or fantasy we have connected with those impressions and associations. And the second part that we want to look at is buffers, right? Buffers are appliances that keep us asleep psychologically. They keep us from feeling our own inner contradictions, and they lessen the shocks that we need in order to awaken and to change our level of being, to stop being what we are and start being what we're not. But that's not going to be possible if we've got buffers that are hindering us from receiving those shocks. So we also need to work on our conscious willpower, developing our conscious willpower, so that we can continue to do our esoteric work, even with the tremendous resistance that we're going to encounter from our own egos that don't want us to awaken our consciousness. All of those desires that we have within. The human organism that we have is exploited by the false personality in order to accomplish egoic goals. Not conscious goals, not goals related to our spiritual development, but egoic goals. As a result, our organism has many problems, the most obvious of which are the physical diseases that are the result of mistaken psychological states, right? Overindulgence, avoidance. Mistaken psychological states are made possible through the wrong working of the centers. Instead of the essence being able to use a given center, we're accustomed to letting the personality, which is at the service of the ego, control it and use that center. So we have egos that live in our intellect, in our emotions, in our movement, in our instincts, in our sex. And they control those centers. We allow them to. And so the centers don't function properly because we allow the personality, which is the vehicle of the ego, to control our human organism. And this has caused the centers to be accustomed to a way of functioning that is inefficient, but not only inefficient, but also terribly problematic. Due to the wrong working of the centers, we spend hours, days, weeks, months, or years feeling negative emotions, worrying about some external event that may never even happen, or fighting for a certain political affiliation, etc. And we don't put that same effort into awareness, self-observation, separating ourselves from our desires. Our centers work so improperly that in some places artificial appliances have been formed in order to cope with the wrong working. And these artificial appliances interfere with all our good intentions. And they're what we call buffers. Remember, buffers are appliances by means of which we can always be in the right. We can always find ourselves right. So be very careful with that. We need to be prepared to find ourselves wrong. That is, to not be in the right. Because it's in this way that we can discover our own inner contradictions. How else would we discover them if we weren't open to being wrong? So that's the end of what we wanted to present to you today. We're going to open it up again for questions and comments. If you have any, please feel free to leave them in the comment area. I want to invite you to our meditation tomorrow, the same time as the time that we started this, which is 7:30 Mountain Time in North America. And next week, we're going to talk about understanding. Understanding and comprehension, we could say, are very similar. But we want to differentiate between knowledge and being. Understanding comes from both knowledge and being. Being is something like experience. So we have knowledge, like ideas in our mind, or could be things that we've learned, that the personality has learned, but we also need experience. We also need to do things. We need to have that, what we call being, related with that thing. If I want to repair a machine, like a lawnmower or something, I might look up the information on the internet and have the information about how to do it, but if I've never done it before, then I don't have any experience with it at all. So then when I actually go to the lawnmower and I work on it, unscrew it and take different parts out and do whatever, then that's the being. That's the experience now that I have. And now I connect that knowledge, which is just book knowledge or just theoretical knowledge, with experience. And now I understand better how the machine works. And so that's what we need to progress, is understanding. We're coming towards the end. There's understanding, comprehension, and elimination. The last 3 classes are coming up this month, July 2021. And we're trying to put all the pieces together now. So next week we'll talk about that on next Thursday, and we invite you to join us. And tomorrow we'll be doing our meditation. We invite you to join us for that as well. In the meantime, it doesn't look like there's any questions or comments. So in the meantime, we're going to wrap it up, and we're going to wish you guys a good day, good week. And as always, we like to say that it's important for us to work on ourselves. And so we wish you the best in your work upon yourself.